Hello and welcome to the Runs World podcast with me, Rick Pearson. Today we're speaking with journalist and sub 3 hour marathoner Kate Carter about running and COVID. So I'm flying solo this week. Ben and Jane are both off. So in place of some kind of, pre-interview banter, I'm going to hit you with a bit of science. There's two studies, both about the marathon, that I think are interesting actually. The first one is all about the importance of marathon pacing, which is something we talk about a lot, but this study really underlines it. And it found that 77%, more than 3/4 of all marathon PBs across runners of all abilities are achieved when people run the first 5 kilometres of their marathon within plus or minus 5% of their intended average marathon pace. So in other words, starting out at a sensible, sustainable pace is the way to run your best marathon. So there's this sort of further proof that actually running kind of even splits is the way to do it. And then another study looked at the kind of psychology of marathon running. It said, to run your second marathon, essentially you've got to forget your first. New research found that runners forget the pain of a marathon, which allows them to sign up for another. And this is a study in the Journal of Pain Research, which is a great kind of bedtime read. And it found that, memory is reconstructive, which makes it less accurate. And there are several studies showing that both acute and chronic pain is often misremembered. And this is particularly true when pain is induced by positively valued experiences, such as a marathon. I think anyone who's run a marathon will kind of, agree with that study that in the moments after you think I'm not going to do that again. That was horrendous. And then a couple of hours, weeks, or months later, you're signing up for another because you remember all the wonderful things that a marathon can give you. So there you go, some science to back up that feeling. We had some great responses a while back to Jane's joy plan, and the kind of question was, when were you happiest running? So I thought I'd throw another question out there because it's always great to get emails in from people who are listening. So if you fancy answering this one, that'd be great. And the question is that I'm interested in is, what's the one thing you'd like to achieve in running before you pack away your trainers for good? And that can be a PB, that could maybe be completing a certain distance. That could just be getting out there regularly and enjoying it. It could be tackling a new terrain, volunteering, or inspiring other people to run. Whatever it is, please let us know. I'll share my one with you. It's a bit specific, and it's actually much shorter distance than I thought it'd be. But I think actually this is the honest truth. I want to run the sub 5 minute mile. I tried a couple of years ago, and I got quite close, and I got kind of injured before I could really give it a proper crack. But I think, the sub 5 minute mile, okay, it's not as famous as a sub 4 minute mile, but that's way beyond my ability. But I'd like to try and do a sub 5 minute mile. And I'm now approaching kind of late 30s, so I feel like maybe my opportunity to run quickly over a mile is beginning to sort of dwindle. So it's something I'd like to have a crack at over the next couple of years. Again, we'd really love to hear about other people's goals. So let us know, please. podcast@runnersworld.co.uk. So look, let's get into the meat of the show here, which is all about running and COVID. So we did get a few letters in a couple of months ago. People were said, look, it'd be great if Runners World tackled the subject of running and COVID, and particularly looking at long COVID and the implications for runners there. So we asked Kate Carter, who's done a few of our longer science pieces, to look into this, talk to the people who are kind of at the vanguard of COVID research, and look at exactly if you have COVID, how quickly can you get back to running? What are some of the red flags? Does running in itself offer you some protection from a disease like COVID and make it less likely that you become seriously ill? So she looked into all that stuff, and there's an article coming out in Runners World magazine at the end of this month. But we thought we'd give you a little preview into some of the things she looked into. So without further ado, let's bring on our guest of the week.
Guest of the week, here in the studio. Guest of the week, sometimes on the phone. Could be an athlete, could be a physio, or a complete unknown.
What can the latest science tell us about when it's safe to lace up our running shoes after a COVID infection, and what the long-term impact on our running may be? Journalist and marathoner Kate Carter has investigated the subject for Runners World, and she's here to tell us more about what she discovered. So Kate, welcome back to the Runners World podcast.
Lovely to be here.
You're sort of fast becoming our sort of science correspondent. Anything big and scientific, we send you out into the world to find out.
I know, it's funny. I think my science teachers at school would be absolutely shocked.
Well, you went really sort of gonzo journalism this, because my understanding is that you actually got COVID while writing a feature about COVID. Is that right?
Yeah, it's like the journalism equivalent of method acting, isn't it? Kind of. Actually, what happened was it was kind of complicated. I thought I had COVID. Well, of course, it's so complicated. Basically, my daughter got it, and the day before she tested positive, I did a half marathon, and I don't normally wear a heart rate monitor, or I just turn off that function on my watch because I don't really. It's just not something I particularly track. But because I had a new Garmin, I'd left it on, and I started running, and I just felt like even after about 5 minutes, I thought, God, it's really hard work. Five minutes of a half marathon, that's not a good sign. I just felt something was very, very wrong. And then the next day, my daughter tested positive for COVID. So I just wonder whether I was fighting it off at that point, or perhaps had it the week before, because I didn't feel ill, just normally. I just felt really weird when I was running. So possibly I had it. But then my daughter got it, and then she was sort of fine, just had a couple of days of feeling a bit ropey, but she's definitely had worse things, and then got better. But then she's actually had a post-viral COVID complication and was in hospital a couple of weeks ago. So it's all been a bit, bit too in-depth research, really.
Wow, yeah, that is. Do you think that as a fit person, as a runner, there's a danger that people might underestimate how severe COVID might be? Because I feel like now we're in this sort of phase of COVID where it's kind of something we're living with, and maybe fit people think, oh, I'll be fine, I'll just shrug it off.
Yes, I mean, yes and no, because the weird thing about COVID is that it does seem so random sometimes. Generally speaking, being fit and being healthy does protect you.
Yeah.
There is, there's a lot of evidence that just being fit and healthy is a really good thing to see you through COVID, essentially. But at the same time, there are people who are extremely fit and healthy who have nevertheless suffered kind of longer term complications, whether it's long COVID or just sort of, struggling with running particularly. Yeah. So on the whole, I'd say, it's obviously a really good thing to be a fit runner, but it doesn't mean that you're completely in the clear, if that makes sense.
Can we talk about some of the kind of the worrying end of this? So that there's some data about how COVID can potentially lead to sort of serious cardiac disease. I think it was called myocarditis or myocarditis.
Myocarditis, yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that? What's the likelihood of that, and what's some of the kind of the science around that?
Yeah, well, this was, so I don't know if you remember, but right in the really, really super early days of COVID, when we were kind of still it all blurs into one, doesn't it? But kind of still in lockdown.
Yeah.
And obviously all the sport stopped. And then there was a point where they started sort of talking about restarting football matches, behind closed doors and stuff. And they did some research on footballers. And I think they only, they did it on footballers because football's where the money is, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
And it sort of seemed to suggest that there was a really an alarming risk of myocarditis, which is basically where you sort of can just keel over, essentially. Yeah. And of course, that's something that in football we have seen horrible, rare instances of. So there was like a super cautious approach and screening people and doing everything super cautiously, which at the time absolutely made sense.
Yeah.
But sort of since then, and over the last couple of years, there's been some bigger studies, and they've sort of come down to the conclusion that myocarditis isn't as serious. The risk of it isn't massively elevated with COVID. I mean, it's a small risk, but it's a small risk that sort of exists anyway, as we have seen, with footballers.
That's good, then.
And it does seem to be something that it's kind of an undiagnosed thing in young men sometimes. So if you screen, 1,000 sporty young men, you will find one or two cases, but you probably would have found them anyway.
Okay. What about the, I guess the lungs is the other area that's often talked about with COVID. Mm-hmm. Lung disease following COVID, how likely does that seem to be?
Well, that seems to be something that running generally does protect against. One of the doctors I spoke to, he said that obviously it is very serious and not something to be taken lightly in people who are vulnerable and so on.
Yeah.
But in athletes that he's seen, he hasn't seen a single example of a kind of long-term lung damage. There's sort of short-term issues, congestion and sort of things that can affect elite athletes who are trying to perform at the very top level. But it does seem to be protective generally against it if you're kind of a fit and healthy person.
One of the interesting things in your article was it talks about resting heart rate and actually how long it takes resting heart rate to return after COVID. It's something like 79 days, isn't it?
Yeah, that really blew my mind. That it was basically a really big study that was done in the States. It was Dr. Jennifer Radin, who I chatted to. She was actually doing this sort of research before COVID came along, and tracking using people's Fitbits and Apple Watches and so on. I mean, obviously with their permission. They sort of signed up to an app and would enter all their data, and it would sort of pull in their resting heart rate and the steps and their sleep and so on. And then they would log if they had any illnesses. And the idea was that you could predict the spread of flu kind of almost quicker than any other method. And then COVID came along and they quickly thought, oh, hang on a second, this is completely applicable to that. So they basically did the same thing. And people, the data all got submitted. And if people got COVID, they logged that. And if they got ill with something which subsequently turned out not to be COVID, another virus, another whatever, they also kind of logged that. And what she found was that the average time for the resting heart rate to go back to normal with COVID people was 79 days. Wow. And the average time for people who got a bug that wasn't COVID was 4 days. So, I mean, it's extraordinary.
Yeah,
and it really, every time anyone says now, oh, it's just another cold, I just sort of want to wave that survey in their faces. Like, no, it's not. I mean, the one thing I guess with that was also early on in COVID. So that's kind of a lot of those people wouldn't have been vaccinated at that point. Okay, yeah. Plus, obviously, it was a different strain of COVID. So now we're kind of going towards more into Omicron, where it does seem to be better tolerated and quicker to recover from. So if they did that now on 80,000 people with Omicron, I'm not sure that would be the same results.
Yeah, but it is interesting, isn't it? And it has kind of implications about how quickly one should return to training and running after COVID. Following your investigation into this, I mean, what are some of the dangers of trying to return too soon? I'm just sort of aware that runners aren't perhaps the most patient people in the world.
Yeah, so and also like the idea of it's very hard, isn't it? Because if you're kind of a committed runner, you're kind of used to pushing through, not pain, but like kind of resistance almost. You feel sluggish, but you go anyway. You feel a bit rubbish, but you go anyway. And we're all sometimes a bit rubbish at kind of knowing whether that's our body saying don't fancy it today or really like a warning sign. But there are these kind of red flags. So like if you feel really short of breath in a kind of unusual way, if your heart's racing, if you're kind of really feeling like that, then you absolutely shouldn't be running. What the kind of implications with the heart rate being slightly higher than normal is that it just sort of recalibrates all your effort levels. So what was easy kind of can seem like moderate, and what was moderate can seem like hard. So your heart doesn't know the difference with your pace, right? So you there's no reason, as long as you're fit and healthy and you're not getting any alarming signs, there's no reason once you've kind of recovered properly that you can't run. It's just recognizing that your pace may not be as kind of comfortable pace or whatever as it was before, but you're still working as hard. So just sort of don't worry about the pace, just work to the effort level.
This is the Runner's World podcast.
So are there any red flags, Kate, that you would get where like if you were like, well, I'm feeling this, so therefore actually I shouldn't be returning to training just yet?
Yeah, I mean things like unexplained breathlessness, which obviously you go and do an interval session, you're going to be breathless at the end, but like sort of suddenly feeling breathless at home or just going up 2 stairs or something, feeling your heart racing, anything like that. And another thing, again, these are rare things. It's important to know that they are rare, and obviously got so many millions of people now have had it and are fine. But there are things like there is a slightly increased risk of getting blood clots after COVID because it kind of makes your blood a bit sticky. So if you get like a sort of I think there's been cases where someone's thought, oh, I've got this sort of swelling in my calf, I've popped a calf muscle or something, but actually it was, it's a blood clot. So just kind of being aware of that. Obviously, if there's anything worrying, get it checked out. But yeah, there are these kind of red flags, but just feeling a bit rubbish, unfortunately, when you're running, unfortunately isn't a red flag. It's just unlucky.
I think one of the scariest areas of COVID is the kind of the long COVID side of stuff, and it's probably a bit of a runner's nightmare, that the idea that you might be like low on energy and all these things associated with long COVID. What did you discover about that end of COVID? Yeah, I think you did talk with a couple of people who had actually been suffering long COVID.
Yes. I mean, my heart just goes out to them. It's just awful because there's so little support, and I mean, there's not enough research yet, maybe not enough money put into it, but certainly not enough time yet, and in the meantime they're kind of left in this awful limbo. So it's awful. It does. Most of the people I've spoken to, they are people who got it early on, so pre-vaccination. So luckily for those of us who've been triple or more jabbed, that does seem to sort of be a bit protective, and also of course the fact that it's now the milder strains of COVID at the moment, at least, coming through, that seems to be kind of better from that point of view as well, because the awful thing is there's very little you could sort of say or do, but it was really striking talking to, because lots of people who have had it were super fit and healthy. They weren't couch potatoes. They weren't kind of people who didn't look after their health. It's just sort of awful luck in some instances. I mean, sometimes it's kind of a compromised immune system, but not that anyone can help that either. But yeah, it's just horrible.
On a more positive note, do you think, as sort of generally speaking, through looking into this, you'd say that running has some kind of, if not a protective element, the idea that regular runners are possibly better equipped to handle a virus like COVID? Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I think there's no doubt that just being fit and healthy is hugely kind of positive, and I think there's some evidence that it can help you recover quicker. Obviously it doesn't have to be running, just sort of generally being fit and healthy. I mean, we've seen that, haven't we, in the last 2 years, that it's really unfortunately the people who have compromised immune systems, who are vulnerable in other ways, who unfortunately have to be super cautious and still having to isolate themselves and so on. And those of us who are lucky enough to be able to get out and be fit and healthy are lucky, because it does seem to protect. It's always kind of, as in so many of these science things, it's always like on the one hand and on the other. We should all be cautious, but we should definitely also try to stay fit and healthy, because generally speaking, I mean, it protects against so many things, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's true. And your own running after suspected COVID, were you kind of quite cautious about getting back into it? Have you found that there's been any kind of lag in kind of getting back to full fitness?
I did feel a bit rubbish for a couple of weeks. I mean, as I say, I don't know. I could have been fighting something else off. I maybe had another. Who knows? Right. I'll never know. Yeah. I did feel a bit like my effort levels were kind of wrong, and I had to slow down, so my easy runs were easier or slower, even though they felt the same and so on. But I just sort of went with that. I didn't have to. I was lucky that I didn't sort of have to stop running. I think I took a few days off just to kind of see, and then I went for a little trot and thinking, actually, I feel fine at this level. So just kind of recalibrating what you think you can cope with on any given day, really.
Yeah. So finally, Kate, what's next for your running then? What are your next goals this year?
Doing some sort of do the Vitality 10K is coming up. I like doing kind of shorter stuff over the summer. I love a track race, so multiple track races. Hopefully some faster stuff. And I've got the Tracksmith Mile coming up as well in May. So it should be fun. And then maybe a marathon in December, maybe.
You're going to be refocusing on the marathon then later in the year.
Yeah, it's been a while, but I think I might do Valencia. Fingers crossed.
Oh yeah, nice. Nice. Kate, thanks so much for coming on the podcast and also researching the fascinating area of COVID, long COVID, and its implications for runners. Always great to have our science correspondent on the podcast, so thank you.
I'll put that on my CV.
So that brings us to the end of this week's Runners World podcast. A big thanks to our guest, Kate Carter, and to you, of course, for listening. You can subscribe to 3 issues of Runners World for just £5. Head over to hurstmagazines.co.uk/Runners World podcast to get this exclusive offer. You can listen to the Runners World podcast on Acast, iTunes, and all your favourite podcast apps. Just search Runners World UK. Please subscribe. It makes us very happy. Thank you for listening, and see you again next week.